At first glance, the period of the emerging new empire doesn't seem promising for elite Roman women. The imperial courts were constantly on the move, shaped by military culture, and women, just as in earlier times, were excluded from formal political office. Even within court life, imperial wives and daughters remained in the background. They lived in the domestic world of the household, the domus, and although they appeared in art, wall paintings and mosaics, they were usually nameless, simply shown as noble women without signs of imperial status. In literature, too, they were mostly defined by their roles as daughters, wives, or mothers of emperors. Their personalities were often crafted to reflect the character of the men around them. Galerius, for example, was described by the Christian author Lactantius as inheriting his harsh nature from his mother. Zosimus blamed Magnentius for ignoring his mother's good advice before the disastrous Battle of Mursa. Even Helena Augusta, Constantine's famous mother who made a religious pilgrimage to the Holy Land, was remembered primarily for supporting her son's Christian mission. When women were seen as overstepping their roles, male writers didn't hesitate to criticize them. Likewise, laws from the time of Diocletian and Constantine did little to expand women's freedoms. Constantine made divorce more difficult for both men and women, penalized eloping lovers, and continued to exclude women from any official role in church leadership. The growing power of Christian bishops, supported by the emperors, did not include women in the church's formal hierarchy. We rarely hear women's voices in the records from this time. Instead, we see them through the lens of male authors. Yet the reality of women's lives was more complex than the laws or sermons suggested. While fathers still officially arranged marriages, the structure of the Roman family had changed since the Augustan era. Legal reforms in the 2nd century and beyond allowed mothers and children to inherit from one another, giving mothers more recognized importance. By the end of the 4th century, a mother could even act as legal guardian for her underage children, so long as she formally pledged not to remarry. This was a major step forward, recognizing women's ability to manage property and make responsible decisions. A key reason behind these legal shifts was the growing financial independence of some women. Even under the formal oversight of guardians, women could often control their wealth, replace their guardians if they chose, and act as patrons. In the Greek-speaking eastern provinces, it was already common for wealthy women to hold local offices or serve as civic benefactors. Although they usually acted on behalf of their families, these roles gave them public visibility. Imperial law later confirmed that while women couldn't hold the powerful praetorship, they were still expected to fulfill its financial responsibilities if required. Women also began to influence the Christian church in less official ways. Because churches, especially outside major cities, relied heavily on donations from lay people, wealthy Christian women gained leverage. While the era of Rome's grand female patrons was still just beginning, like the noble women who supported Jerome and Pelagius, or Olympias, who aided John Chrysostom in Constantinople, the seeds of change were already visible in Diocletian's reign. Female believers were starting to assert their presence, not through political office, but through wealth, guardianship, and acts of devotion that would shape the church and society in the generations to come. In the late Roman Empire, the wives and daughters of emperors played a vital, if often silent, role in shaping political alliances and supporting dynastic continuity. While women could not become emperors themselves, their marriages and children were central to forming and maintaining imperial lineages. This wasn't a new development. Earlier rulers like Gaius and Nero had drawn legitimacy from their descent through the female line of Augustus. In times when male heirs were lacking, imperial daughters and their offspring could unexpectedly become crucial figures, whether they sought that power or not. During the Tetrarchy, dynastic alliances were sealed through marriage. Diocletian's two Caesars were both sons-in-law to their senior emperors. Maxentius married Galerius's daughter, Valeria Maximilla, though that alliance ultimately didn't secure his claim to power. Later, Constantine married Fausta, and Licinius wed Constantia, Constantine's sister, further cementing the political partnerships of the age. Still, despite their essential role in dynastic strategy, these imperial women had no individual public identity. Their presence in history is mainly as extensions of their husbands and fathers. In a world dominated by military emperors, there was no room for romanticized ideas of courtly honor. Consider Fausta, Constantine's empress, who spent nearly 2 decades married to the man responsible for killing both her father and brother. According to the Christian writer Lactantius, she survived by revealing a plot by her father to assassinate Constantine, a story that may have been invented to explain why she remained in favor, or even alive. The political survival of imperial women often depended on the fate of their male relatives. If their husbands or sons fell from power, they were seen as dangerous symbols, potential figureheads for rebellion, and were treated harshly. After his victory in 313, Licinius executed Galerius's adopted son, Candidianus, the children of Maximinus Daza, and even Severianus, the son of the deceased Augustus Severus. Galerius's widow Valeria and Diocletian's widow Prisca were also hunted down and killed. As Lactantius observed, their downfall was tied not to scandal or wrongdoing, but to their station in life and reputation for modesty, qualities that became their undoing. There were exceptions. When Constantius II purged rival claimants in 337, he spared the women and children of his relatives. But political bloodshed continued. In 350, the elder Eutropia, half-sister of Constantine, was killed in Rome after the fall of her son, Nepotianus. Then there is the murky case of Fausta's death in 326, which followed closely after Constantine's execution of his son Crispus. Rumors swirled that Fausta had been murdered as well, possibly in a heated court scandal. Although she married Constantine in 307, it's possible the union began as a betrothal, since she didn't bear children for almost a decade. Her sudden fertility afterward, producing multiple sons and daughters, has led some to speculate about a delayed consummation. Complicating the family tree, Fausta was the younger sister of Theodora, making Constantine his own father's brother-in-law. She may have been closer in age to Crispus than to Constantine himself. Little is known of Fausta's personal beliefs, and her role in Christian affairs is unclear. Constantine used her property for the Council of Rome in 313, but that only proves her assets were effectively controlled by her husband. Her life at court may have been marked by both resentment and fear, especially if Constantine II, born in 316, was the son of another woman. That would certainly have created tension. Furthermore, Constantine's delay in elevating Fausta and his mother Helena to the title of Augusta until around 324, when it became politically useful, suggests their public recognition was always tied to dynastic strategy, not personal merit or affection. In the end, these imperial women lived in a world where their influence was real but constrained, shaped by marriage, motherhood, and the shifting fortunes of the men around them. Their stories remind us that power in the Roman Empire was often a dangerous inheritance. The sudden disappearance of Empress Fausta in 326 remains one of the most mysterious episodes in Roman imperial history. Even at the time, no clear reason was given for her death, and that silence has only fueled speculation ever since. The Constantinian palace was shrouded in secrecy, and ancient writers filled in the gaps with dramatic tales, borrowing from famous myths like that of Phaedra and Hippolytus, or the biblical story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. One popular version claimed Fausta tried to seduce her stepson, Crispus, and after he rejected her, she accused him of impropriety, leading Constantine to execute his son and then kill Fausta in remorse. Another account, hostile to Constantine, compared him to the infamous Emperor Nero. Fausta's supposed death by suffocation in a steam bath was said to echo Nero's murder of his innocent wife Octavia. A Latin poem from the 5th century bishop Sidonius Apollinaris lamented a new Neronian age, replacing the golden age of Saturn, a reference tied to Christian writer Lactantius, who contrasted the peaceful reign of Saturn with the tyranny of Jupiter, a symbolic jab at Diocletian. Pagan historians offered yet another interpretation. According to Eunapius and later Zosimus, Constantine's guilt over killing his wife and son led him to convert to Christianity, a religion, they suggested, that offered forgiveness even for such crimes. With no solid facts available, rumor and propaganda took over, each version shaped by political or religious agendas. Many theories tried to explain what really happened. Some said Fausta and Crispus had been allies, seeking to strengthen Crispus's position, using Fausta's lineage as the daughter of Maximian. Others believed Fausta saw Crispus as a threat to her own young sons, who were still children at the time. Tensions in the imperial family were common. Constantine himself, the son of Helena, had sidelined the children of Constantius and his second wife, Theodora. And Crispus, Constantine's son by Minervina, was rapidly gaining military acclaim. It's clear that competition among imperial children from different mothers was a source of instability, and that rivalry between Helena's and Theodora's descendants continued into the next generation. The family tragedy of 326 marked a major turning point. After celebrating 20 years of rule with a final visit to Rome, Constantine returned east, never to set foot in the old capital again. His new court resembled a royal household of widows. Helena, his mother, and the once rejected wife of Constantius I, Eutropia, widow of Maximian and mother of both Fausta and the defeated Maxentius, and Constantia, sister of Constantine, who had begged in vain for the life of her husband, Licinius. With their political influence diminished, these women turned to faith. Constantia returned to a traditional female role as a peacemaker, trying to mediate tensions between her brother and the followers of Eusebius of Nicomedia after the Council of Nicaea. Helena and Eutropia took bolder steps, embarking on pilgrimages to the Holy Land. Eutropia even wrote to Constantine, complaining about the neglected state of the sacred site at Mamre. Helena, representing her son's imperial vision, played a key role in transforming Jerusalem into a center for Christian pilgrimage. Fausta's death marked a low point for imperial women, revealing how easily they could fall victim to palace intrigue and political purges. But in its aftermath, a new model of female influence began to emerge. Women who had lost power at court found renewed purpose as religious patrons. A century later, Empress Aelia Eudocia, after her political conflict with Pulcheria, the powerful sister of Theodosius II, retreated to the Holy Land, where she gained lasting prestige through her support of sacred sites. Christian patronage gave women like Helena, Eutropia, and Eudocia a respected public role. Yet it also conveniently removed them from the political spotlight. While their pilgrimages and church-building projects were later celebrated, their departure from court might equally be seen as political exile. Constantine maintained the appearance of family harmony, publicly respecting Eutropia's opinions about Mamre, but only by ensuring that powerful women stayed at a distance. Thus, the story of Fausta's fall, the exile of Helena, and the retreat of later empresses reflects both the vulnerability and adaptability of imperial women. They could be removed from power, but they found new ways to influence Roman society through faith, patronage, and memory. In the later Roman Empire, many elite women turned to Christianity not simply out of devotion, but because it offered them an alternative path to status and influence, especially when political power was inaccessible. This dynamic is best illustrated by figures like Helena, the mother of Constantine, who spent many years in Rome at her palace on the Esquiline Hill. Although we have little direct information about her impact during that time, she built churches and baths and was eventually buried there, suggesting a prominent but subtle role in shaping Roman Christian culture. One of the first aristocratic Roman women to adopt an ascetic lifestyle was Marcella. She rejected a second marriage to the Christian senator Neratius Cerealis, choosing instead to study the Bible and devote herself to a life of piety. This decision may have been influenced by the examples of other prominent Christian women in Rome, possibly Helena, Eutropia, Constantia, or especially Constantina, who was known for her devotion to Saint Agnes. Cerealis himself had family ties to the imperial household, as his sister Galla was the mother of Caesar Gallus, husband of Constantina. Marcella's lifestyle became a model for other noblewomen, particularly in the 300s and 80s, when a group of Roman senators' daughters were inspired by Jerome, the Christian scholar. These women gave away their wealth, or passed it to their heirs, and embraced the ascetic life as a means of achieving spiritual nobility. As Jerome put it, for widows who had lost their social status and young women not yet married, turning to asceticism was a respectable and empowering alternative. Meanwhile, within the imperial court, Christian patronage served a dual purpose for women. It offered visibility and virtue, but also conveniently moved them away from the volatile centers of political power. Historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing about Emperor Constantius II's court, described it as dysfunctional and filled with paranoia. He criticized the emperor's reliance on flatterers, women, and eunuchs. Still, Ammianus acknowledged that these figures, especially women, often acted as mediators and diffused tensions. He praised some, like Eutherius, a eunuch who protected Julian, but condemned others, such as Eusebius, a powerful chamberlain who interfered in church affairs and political trials until his execution in 361. Eunuchs, because they could not produce heirs, were seen as safe companions for emperors, free of dynastic ambitions. Despite Ammianus's general suspicion of female influence, he admired Eusebia, Constantius's second wife, for her role in protecting Julian, his personal hero. Eusebia defended Julian against accusations linking him to his disgraced brother Gallus and helped secure his journey to Athens to complete his education. She was also instrumental in having him appointed as Caesar in 355 and arranged his marriage to Helena, Constantius's sister. But even Eusebia's story was not free from darker interpretations. Ammianus revived an old literary trope, the suspicion of women as poisoners, accusing her of bribing a midwife to kill Helena's newborn and of using drugs to prevent further pregnancies. Whether true or not, these claims reflect the persistent unease around women's influence in imperial politics. Eusebia came from an elite background. Her father had been consul, and her family was deeply connected to the Roman ruling class. She died young and was succeeded by Faustina, who gave birth to Constantius's posthumous daughter and future wife of Emperor Gratian. In a tense political atmosphere where suspicion dominated, Eusebia played a vital role as a stabilizing force. Her influence over Julian was not just personal, but deeply political. In a speech of gratitude that Julian later composed in her honor, he portrayed her as the ideal empress, wise, virtuous, generous, and noble in both spirit and birth. Julian, always keen to frame his ideas through classical philosophy, defended his praise for Eusebia by referencing Plato, Aristotle, and Homer. If men could be praised for their virtue, he argued, why not women? He cited examples from Homer. Odysseus received help from the Phaeacian princess Nausicaa and her mother Arete, and he famously loved Penelope above all other women, even goddesses. Similarly, Julian said, Eusebia deserved the same praise a man would receive for loyalty and virtue. Though Julian avoided detailing her political actions too explicitly, he credited Eusebia with 3 major contributions to his life: defending him from court intrigue, securing his trip to Athens, and giving him a precious gift of books. These gestures allowed Julian to cast her as both a good empress and a philosopher queen, someone who embodied the virtues of wisdom, restraint, and moral excellence. In doing so, he offered a rare but idealized glimpse into the potential power of women in the late Roman world, even as they navigated a court filled with suspicion and danger. His vision, however, remained largely symbolic, far from the brutal realities of palace politics that continued to shape the lives and fates of imperial women. Eusebia, the empress praised by Julian for her support and influence at court, was celebrated publicly. But like many women of her time, she remained a figure shaped by stereotypes. Her voice is absent, her influence recognized, yet framed entirely through male narratives. However, in the generations that followed, more assertive and politically active women stepped into the spotlight. Justina, first married to the usurper Magnentius, and then to Emperor Valentinian I, wielded considerable power as regent during her son Valentinian II's youth. She even challenged the powerful Bishop Ambrose of Milan in the 300s and 80s. In the 5th century, Galla Placidia served as regent for her son, Valentinian III, and engaged in diplomatic correspondence with Pulcheria, sister of Emperor Theodosius II. The rise of these women reflected a broader pattern. Christianity played a central role in amplifying the influence of empresses like Eudoxia, wife of Emperor Arcadius, who used her authority to help remove the influential bishop John Chrysostom. Pulcheria, too, emerged as a key figure in church politics, contributing to the fall of Nestorius. The children of Arcadius followed a different path in dynastic politics. The emperor's sisters took vows of virginity, and Theodosius II chose a wife, Aelia Eudocia, from outside the aristocracy. This unconventional strategy avoided dangerous political alliances and kept rival factions at bay. During periods when child emperors like Theodosius II and Valentinian III ruled, older female relatives could step in as de facto leaders. Mothers and sisters of child rulers had opportunities for power that were not available to the wives of strong, adult emperors. More broadly, Christianity gave aristocratic women, imperial and non-imperial alike, a new space to assert themselves. Simultaneously, the political landscape of the empire was shifting. By the early 5th century, emperors in the East had settled permanently in Constantinople. The once mobile imperial court, shaped by military campaigns and masculine power structures, gave way to a more ornate and ceremonial environment. Though still barred from formal office or decision-making, empresses began to shape policy behind the scenes and through religious patronage. One of the most prominent benefactors of the Roman Church in the mid-4th century was Constantina, daughter of Constantine the Great. After the death of her first husband, Hannibalianus, in the political purges of 337, she later married Gallus Caesar. On imperial land near the supposed tomb of Saint Agnes, Constantina built a grand funerary basilica for herself. Inscriptions on the site declared her devotion to God, praised Christ's help, and celebrated Agnes as a victorious virgin who had triumphed over paganism. The poem engraved there formed an acrostic reading, Constantina to God, boldly affirming her right to address the divine directly. Saint Agnes became a special protector of the imperial women. When Julian's wife, Helena, died in 360, she too was buried at the Saint Agnes site. In life, Constantina was known, perhaps infamously, for sharing Gallus's harshness and obsession with conspiracies. She died in 354, just before Gallus was executed. While it's unclear how complicit she was in political violence, it's likely that Constantina's public support of a female saint continued the tradition of earlier women like Helena and Eutropia, who used church patronage as a form of personal expression and power. These acts of Christian building and dedication by women from the imperial family contributed to a broader trend: increased involvement of aristocratic women in the Roman Church. Although Helena's years in Rome are poorly documented, her presence may have helped inspire this movement. One story from 357 tells of devout Roman women petitioning Emperor Constantius to reinstate Pope Liberius, and then openly protesting when he refused. Even if apocryphal, this tale captures a real cultural shift. Elite Christian women in Rome were beginning to act collectively, shaping a new identity rooted in faith and moral authority. This transformation had its origins in the powerful women of Constantine's dynasty, but its influence would echo throughout the empire in the centuries to come. In the legal traditions of the Roman Empire, women were often portrayed as emotionally fragile and intellectually weak, a stereotype that justified their exclusion from many legal responsibilities. While the 2nd century jurist Gaius had challenged this notion, it continued to influence policy for generations. Women could act on behalf of their own families, but they were generally barred from representing others in court. Yet, ironically, this image of weakness sometimes became a legal weapon in itself. By embracing the language of vulnerability, many women successfully positioned themselves as sympathetic petitioners deserving of special treatment. For instance, in the year 297, a woman named Aurelia Didyme appealed to a governor, claiming her uncles had stolen her inheritance. In her petition, she stated that the race of women is easily despised because of the weakness of our nature. Another Aurelia, a wealthy landowner with sons serving in the military, claimed her agents had defrauded her and emphasized her identity as a helpless widow to win favor. Similarly, Aurelia Atiaris from Hermopolis told officials she had been beaten and imprisoned while trying to collect a debt. She even named one of her attackers, Apion, a notorious figure known as a sheep shearer by night. Her story was echoed by a man named Aurelius Abul, who also accused Apion of criminal activity. linking him to a local chief of police. By the time of Constantine, the image of women shifted from being merely weak to being defined by modesty, a trait that both protected and restricted them. Imperial laws stressed that women should avoid public court appearances and gatherings of men, supposedly to preserve their dignity. Legal officers were forbidden to arrest women inside their homes or to expose them publicly. Even women who were legally recognized as adults were expected to remain indoors and let a male agent speak on their behalf. This idea of protecting modesty extended even to convicted women criminals. Rulings from Constantine's son, Constantius II, insisted that prison spaces remain gender segregated. Constantine's marriage laws followed this same trend of tightening social order. Although Roman tradition had long treated marriage as a mutual agreement based on shared intent, called affectio maritalis, the emperor began to impose stricter boundaries. He limited no-fault divorce and emphasized the consequences of who initiated a separation. Marriage, once informal and based on verbal intent, now required more structure. Constantine regulated betrothal practices, insisting on the return of engagement gifts if one party withdrew or died. He expected marriages to follow within 2 years of engagement, and even declared that a symbolic kiss could make the betrothal legally binding. He also addressed the boundaries between social classes in marriage. Earlier laws under Augustus had prohibited senators from marrying freedwomen. Constantine expanded this restriction to include members of the city council and provincial priests, stating that they too could not marry women considered of low or abject status, such as tavern workers and actresses. Although such women could still be concubines, their relationships with higher status men were not recognized as legitimate marriages. Interestingly, Constantine's law did not address slaves, whose unions were never legally binding anyway. His purpose was clear: to discourage elite men from marrying beneath their social rank, even if the law lacked precise definitions. In short, Constantine's legal reforms reflect a changing Roman world. Women were still officially limited by stereotypes, but some used those same assumptions to assert their rights. Marriage was reshaped not just by Christian morality, but also by social pressures, with growing emphasis on formality, modesty, and the preservation of class boundaries. Through law and language alike, the Roman Empire continued to define and redefine a woman's place in society. Despite the legal and cultural stereotypes that painted women as weak or passive, many Roman women were anything but silent victims. In fact, the surviving petitions from Egypt reveal just how actively women engaged with the legal system to defend their rights. Like men, they knew how to work the law, and often used the language of victimhood to increase their chances of success. For example, Aurelia Maria filed a complaint after losing livestock, naming the culprits based on evidence gathered by local guards and expecting the judge Abenaeus to act accordingly. Her case is just one of many where women confidently brought forward their own grievances using the formal procedures available to them. Far from being isolated or powerless, women were often landowners and respected figures in their local communities. They used the same legal tools and rhetoric as men, and sometimes more cleverly. Many emphasized their suffering, claiming to be beaten to the brink of death in order to gain sympathy. Illiteracy wasn't a barrier either. Both men and women commonly visited village scribes, who knew how to phrase complaints in ways that echoed imperial values of justice and mercy, hoping to persuade officials to act accordingly. This was a widespread trend. About a quarter of the petitioners in the surviving parts of the Codex Hermogenianus, a legal code compiled under Emperor Diocletian, were women. They demanded fair treatment at the highest levels of the empire. Some were denied, like Asclepiodota, advised not to intervene in her husband's debts. Others succeeded, like Philotera, who was assured she wouldn't be held responsible for her son's liabilities. Faustina, disinherited by her father for refusing to leave her husband, was allowed to contest the will, arguing it was unjust. And Alexander, a husband forcibly separated from his wife, was given the right to sue for her return, if she agreed publicly. Still, not every case went their way. There were limits to how far imperial law would bend to claims of womanly weakness. For instance, a woman named Frontina said she didn't know the law during a property dispute, but the excuse was dismissed. Legal ignorance wasn't an acceptable defense unless the person was a minor. Similarly, Cosmia was criticized for trying to bring a forgery case, something women were not allowed to do unless it directly involved their family. Others, like Caelestina, made suggestions to improve the law. She proposed dividing her children between parents by gender after divorce. The emperor rejected this idea, insisting that a local judge decide. Interestingly, there was one type of woman who didn't need to claim weakness at all: the woman philosopher. Elite Roman women often received excellent educations, and some became prominent intellectuals. This tradition dated back to Theano, wife of Pythagoras, and reached its height with thinkers like Hypatia of Alexandria, tragically murdered by a mob in 415. In the 4th century, the Neoplatonist Sosipater went even further. She predicted her husband would die 5 years after marriage, and he did. She claimed that in the afterlife, she would ascend to a higher spiritual state than him. Despite her remarkable abilities, Sosipater still relied on a male relative of her husband to manage her finances and help determine where she lived. This image of the powerful female thinker also influenced Christian women. While some, like the aristocratic supporters of Jerome and Pelagius, appeared to rely on male teachers, they often studied so rigorously that even Jerome found it hard to keep up. Women also found spiritual strength in female saints. Agnes, for instance, became a symbol of Christian womanhood, and her tomb became the final resting place for several imperial women. Other stories, like that of the legendary Thecla, who rejected marriage to follow St. Paul and later became a preacher, provided early Christian women with powerful models of independence and faith. In short, Roman women were far more active, intelligent, and resourceful than many laws or writers of the time acknowledged. Whether through legal petitions, philosophical debate, or Christian devotion, they found ways to assert their voices and shape their world. By the end of the 4th century, Helena Augusta was no longer just a distant memory. She had re-emerged as a powerful symbol of a new kind of imperial woman, reflecting the growing prominence of female figures within the Theodosian dynasty. Helena was not only remembered as Augusta, the empress, but also transformed in legend into a humble yet virtuous figure, the bona stabularia, the righteous innkeeper. This shift in her image mirrored the broader evolution in the roles and influence of elite Roman women since her time. Under Constantine, laws portrayed women as modest figures, hidden away at home and shielded from public life. That ideal was reflected in the way Constantine himself managed his household. Kept private, concealed from the public, and still veiled in mystery today. But such ideals never truly captured the reality of women's lives. In practice, women, especially those with their own wealth, found numerous ways to participate actively in society. With the rise of Christianity, their opportunities for influence expanded even further, despite being excluded from official religious roles. Wealthy women became patrons of churches, religious foundations, and cultural life. Meanwhile, those of humbler status also navigated the system to protect their property and well-being. They bombarded governors, officials, and even emperors with petitions, demanding justice and recognition. These strategies were not new, but they became more visible and effective as the imperial court grew more stable and less mobile, especially under the Theodosian rulers in Constantinople. As the 5th century began, a new era was unfolding, an age shaped by powerful imperial women like Eudoxia, Galla Placidia, Pulcheria, and Eudocia. These were the successors to Helena, carrying forward her legacy, but also transforming it. They weren't just symbols, they were active players in imperial politics, Christian patronage, and cultural leadership. The age of the new Helenas had arrived, and it would leave a lasting mark on the history of the Eastern Roman Empire. By the late 4th century, the city of Constantinople was slowly rising to become the new capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. But before it fully took on that role, the city of Antioch remained the true center of military and political operations in the East, especially under emperors like Constantius II and his successor Julian. Antioch had a long and prestigious past. It boasted a powerful local elite, a rich intellectual tradition, and deep ties to imperial authority. It was a bustling city, both politically and culturally alive, shaped over centuries by close interaction with emperors and their courts. In contrast, the city of Rome, often referred to as the Eternal City, had become somewhat removed from the actual workings of imperial power. Though once the heart of the empire, it had taken on a more symbolic role. Even satirists like Ammianus Marcellinus, writing from Rome around the year 390, joked that no real business was ever conducted there anymore. Still, the city's deep historical and cultural legacy gave it unmatched prestige. And when an emperor visited, it became a major event. Constantius II's visit to Rome in the year 357 was a grand performance meant to honor that legacy. Riding in a golden, jewel-covered chariot and flanked by armed troops, he entered the city in full imperial glory. Ornamental standards whipped in the wind, purple dragons on golden spears, hissing with power. Crowds applauded from all sides. Constantius sat still and regal throughout, never breaking his composed demeanor. Not even a bump in the road could shake him. Once inside, he followed tradition. He addressed the Senate in their chamber and spoke to the people from the public platform, following customs that dated back to the Roman Republic. At the chariot races, a favorite spectacle of the Roman people, he even exchanged playful remarks with the crowd, respecting their age-old right to free speech. This ceremonial visit wasn't just about appearances. It showed that Constantius understood the symbolic power of Rome. He honored its past and played his part as a rightful heir of Caesar. In return, the Senate supported him and later even rejected the ambitions of Julian in 361. Constantius's reverence for Rome was expressed not only through his actions, but also through his admiration of the city's architecture. From the rostra, he marveled at the city's iconic landmarks: the towering Temple of Jupiter, the Grand Pantheon, Trajan's Forum, the baths, the amphitheater, and temples built by past emperors like Vespasian and Hadrian. In Ammianus's vivid account, this was a city of stone and memory, defined by imperial greatness and pagan grandeur. But there was another side to Rome, one less visible in Ammianus's description. The Christian transformation of the city was already underway. Constantine had built churches like the Lateran on the Caelian Hill and the original St. Peter's Basilica on the Vatican, often on or near sites linked with his defeated rival Maxentius. However, his sons, Constans and Constantius, didn't seem to invest much energy in expanding the Christian landscape of Rome. According to the Liber Pontificalis, the Book of Popes, there's little record of any new imperial donations to churches during the reign of Pope Julius I. Still, the bishops of Rome were not idle. Even without strong imperial backing, they actively pushed forward the Christianization of the urban landscape. Bishop Marcus, who served briefly in 336, is credited with founding 2 churches. Constantine is said to have supported them with land and ceremonial gifts, but left the design in the hands of the bishops. Julius, his successor, was associated with as many as 7 basilicas and 3 burial churches. Some were even located near the Forum, the very heart of Old Rome. These early efforts by the Church show a clear determination to reshape the city in Christian terms, laying the groundwork for the transformation of the Eternal City from a monument to imperial Rome into a center of Christian power. During the mid-4th century, religious and political tensions in Rome reached a breaking point with the controversy surrounding Bishop Liberius. After taking office in 352, Liberius was exiled just 3 years later by Emperor Constantius II due to his refusal to condemn Athanasius. In his place, Constantius appointed Felix, the archdeacon, as bishop. But many in Rome, including a significant portion of the clergy and laity, refused to accept this imperial interference and stayed loyal to Liberius. The resulting schism was not only ideological, it had a geographical aspect too. Felix established his base in the southwestern part of the city, taking over a basilica in Trastevere that had been built by Julius, but he was unable to extend his control across the city. When Liberius returned to Rome in 358, having reconciled with Constantius, he attempted to heal the rift. Though he succeeded to a degree, violence would erupt again after his death in 366. During the reigns of Constantius and Julian, Christian involvement in aristocratic patronage remained limited. One of the few prominent Christian senators of the time was Julius Bassus, who died in 359 while serving as urban prefect. His sarcophagus, richly decorated with Christian imagery blended into traditional Roman iconography, demonstrates how Christian symbolism was beginning to be accepted among the elite. Meanwhile, Rome itself gained new symbolic status as a burial place for imperial women. Both Constantina and Helena, wife of Julian, were posthumously associated with Saint Agnes, the victorious Christian virgin martyr, indicating a subtle but powerful assertion by imperial women choosing Rome as their final resting place. In the broader political sphere, there were few known Christian holders of the city prefecture during the 340s and 350s. One exception was Flavius Leontius, who briefly held the post from 355 to 356. Most prefects remained committed to traditional Roman religion. One such figure was Maecius Memmius, Furius Baburius Caecilianus Placidus, who held both the consulship and city prefecture under Constans. Another, Quintus Flavius Maecius Egnatius Lollianus, nicknamed Mavortius, had a long and complex career under both Constantine and Constantius. A known enthusiast of astrology, Mavortius encouraged Firmicus Maternus to write on the subject, although Maternus later converted to Christianity and turned his rhetorical talents against paganism. The complex religious landscape even produced moments of unintended symbolism. In 348, the city prefect Tertullus, facing a grain shortage and angry mobs, sacrificed at the Temple of Castor in Ostia, just as the delayed grain ships miraculously arrived. One of the most significant defenders of traditional religion among Rome's elite was Memmius Vitrasius Orphetus, a priest of Vesta and devotee of Apollo. His daughter, Rusticiana, later married Quintus Aurelius Symmachus, a passionate advocate of the old ways. Orphetus himself climbed the traditional ranks of the senatorial career path, becoming a quaestor, praetor, suffect consul, and eventually prefect of the city. He represented the Senate before Constantius II during the rebellion of Magnentius, and was later rewarded with the prestigious rank of Count of the First Order. After serving as proconsul of Africa, he returned to the city and held the prefecture twice, notably presiding over the Senate when Constantius visited in 357. It's difficult to fully gauge how these religious affiliations influenced the daily behavior of Rome's aristocracy. While Constantius removed the altar of victory from the Senate House to please Christian senators, it was quickly restored, likely even before Julian came to power. Senators generally preferred to negotiate laws with the emperor, rather than simply accept them. Although beliefs differed, the aristocracy was bound by a strong sense of shared identity. Debates could be intense, but outright conflict was usually kept in check. In 341, Emperor Constans had issued a directive to eliminate sacrifices, continuing Constantine's earlier policies. Yet he stopped short of stripping public funding from the traditional priesthoods. This led to confusion, prompting the Senate and prefect to request clarification. Constans responded with a compromise. Temples could remain open for non-sacrificial public festivals and were to be protected from damage. This delicate balancing act between tradition and reform illustrates the cultural tightrope emperors had to walk as Rome transitioned from pagan roots to Christian future. One law, one monument, and one patron at a time. Even as Emperor Constans took a strong stance against pagan superstition, his laws reveal a careful balancing act, one shaped by advisors who understood the need to respect Rome's deeply rooted religious traditions. In 349, for example, the ancient priestly college of the pontifices, which had overseen rituals and aspects of family law since the founding of Rome, was officially granted authority to block the demolition of tombs if they deemed the act impious. This acknowledgement showed that despite Constans' Christian convictions and his refusal to use the title of Pontifex Maximus, he still respected the authority of Rome's traditional religious institutions. Burial sites were sacred for both pagans and Christians, and Constans' gesture reflected shared cultural values. These decisions weren't made in isolation. Constans worked closely with the city prefect, who served as the Senate's representative and managed the administration of Rome. Like later prefects, such as Symmachus, the prefect at the time was responsible for onboarding new senators, monitoring their performance, and managing vital city functions, especially food and wine distribution. But supply chains were vulnerable. Delays in grain shipments, even with the city's massive storage capacity, sometimes led to riots. One such incident occurred in 348 under the prefect Tertullus, and in 365, Symmachus himself was confronted by an angry mob accusing him of price-gouging wine. He responded defiantly, threatening to burn the wine in lime kilns rather than sell it cheaply. Wine trouble even followed Symmachus's family. His father-in-law Orphetus was later accused of owing money to the wine treasury, a debt the emperors tried to recover from Tertullus, and eventually Symmachus himself, who denied inheriting anything. The city prefect also held high legal authority. Acting vice sacra judicans, in the emperor's place, he judged civil and criminal cases across the city. There was no official courtroom. Instead, the prefect moved through different public locations, delivering justice in open spaces. This mobility allowed quick responses to emergencies, like the protest in 356 over a charioteer's arrest. The prefect at the time, Leontius, was known for swift and just rulings, though sometimes too strict. When a second riot broke out over wine, he identified the ringleader, Petrus Valvameris, and had him flogged on the spot, an act that quickly ended the unrest. Prefects regularly faced legal complexities requiring imperial input, especially in matters involving Rome's elite. During the 300s and 50s, the correspondence between Orphetus and Constantius II focused more on family and property law than religion. For example, what happened if a man gave lavish gifts to freedmen but later had children? The emperor ruled the gifts should be returned. What if a mother gave a gift to an ungrateful child? In 358, Constantius declared such a child had to return the entire gift, but not if the mother remarried or had a questionable reputation. These rulings showed that Roman law evolved case by case, shaped by human behavior as much as legal principle. Gift-giving laws could be murky. Constantine had earlier ruled that gifts between parents and children were exempt from formal procedures like mancipatio and public registration. While this simplified things for families, it confused others. Did the exemption apply to unrelated individuals? In 341, Constans reaffirmed to the city prefect that all other gifts had to be registered. A decade later, Orphetus had to seek clarification again, confirming that only gifts between parents and children could bypass the formalities. The constant exchange of letters between the Senate and the emperor reveals how Roman governance operated through negotiation and distance. Because emperors often lived far from the capital, senators had fewer chances to directly influence imperial decisions. This distance could lead to miscommunications, such as in 370, when Emperor Valentinian IV had to be convinced not to subject senators to torture in treason trials. Yet this separation also protected the Senate's autonomy. Despite imperial oversight by the vicarius and the praetorian prefect, Roman senators retained influence, thanks to their massive wealth, ancestral lands across Italy and Africa, and the enduring cultural prestige of the Eternal City. Even as Christianity rose in prominence and Peter and Paul came to symbolize Rome's new spiritual foundations, many still clung to the belief that Rome, with all its grandeur and traditions, would continue forever. During the reigns of Constantius II and Julian, the city of Antioch in Syria stood out as an imperial capital, though not in a permanent sense like Constantinople would later become. Its importance was mainly tied to its strategic value as a military base for Eastern campaigns, especially during times of tension with the Persian Empire. In times of peace, however, its location, far from both the Eastern Empire's core and the Danube frontier, limited its effectiveness as a capital. This geographic drawback meant that, over time, Constantinople's more central position made it the natural seat of government and administration in the East. Still, even when emperors weren't present, Antioch served as a key administrative hub, housing the offices of the praetorian prefect, the governor of Syria, the count of the East, and the general responsible for Eastern military operations. One of the richest sources we have on 4th century Antioch is the writings of Libanius, a renowned orator and teacher of rhetoric. A passionate defender of Hellenic culture and its traditions, Libanius became closely aligned with Julian the Apostate, who shared his admiration for Greek philosophy, history, and language. Though officially exempt from civic duties because of his role as a public professor, Libanius still involved himself deeply in local politics, often defending the city's elite with whom he was personally connected. His speeches and letters reveal not only his commitment to education and culture, but also the crucial role of rhetoric and writing in shaping public life during late antiquity. As a public orator, Libanius praised both his city and its emperors, delivering formal panegyrics for Constantius, Constans, and Julian, and later defending causes such as the preservation of pagan temples under Theodosius I. His attacks on corrupt officials, like the scathing critique of Governor Tisamenos in 386, show his willingness to speak out when injustice arose. Even his written letters served more than a personal purpose. They were crafted to win legal cases, secure jobs for his students, and influence officials, while also showcasing his intellect and cultural refinement. Libanius's own story begins with youthful defiance. Born in Antioch, he surprised his family at age 15 by abandoning popular entertainments, chariot races, theater, gladiator shows, and even his pet pigeons, to pursue a life of rhetoric. His dedication mirrored the asceticism of Christian monks, but his path led him to the intellectual world of sophistry. After studying in Athens, he taught in several cities, including Constantinople, where he faced rivalry and even threats. Eventually, in 355, he returned to Antioch to take up a permanent teaching post, finally finding stability and the platform to shape the city's cultural life. He even campaigned for official salaries for his teaching assistants, a testament to his commitment to institutional education. In 356, Libanius gave a famous speech in honor of Antioch at the city's Olympic festival, describing it as the ideal city, a place richer than the oldest states, superior in size, agriculture, and intellect. Its witty population, mild winters, clear water, and flourishing philosophy made it, in his words, superior even to Rome. Anyone who left Antioch, he claimed, would never forget it. Those who arrived would forget where they came from. Although this kind of praise was expected in ceremonial speeches, Libanius still had to be convincing to his local audience. His words held weight because there was truth behind the flattery. Antioch sat on the Orontes River, a short ride from its port at Seleucia, which had been fortified by Diocletian for both trade and military use. The city benefited from goods flowing in from all over the empire and from a fertile countryside rich in olives, grapes, and grain. Water, too, was in abundance. Libanius celebrated the springs of Daphne, a lush suburb known as the Palace of the Nymphs. The waters were cool, sweet, and flowed into the city, filling fountains, public baths, and homes alike. Yet, despite the idealistic image, reality could be more complicated. Libanius failed to mention the instability caused by military campaigns. As Emperor Julian would find out in 362, the presence of large armies disrupted the balance of supply and demand. Food shortages, price spikes, and civil unrest followed, reminding everyone that no amount of rhetorical charm could change the hard facts of urban logistics during war. In the end, Antioch was both a city of dreams and of struggles, celebrated in soaring speeches, yet shaped by the shifting tides of empire, politics, and survival. In the eyes of the famous teacher and orator Libanius, the beauty and structure of Antioch helped shape a strong and vibrant civic life. He believed that the city's physical design encouraged daily interaction, especially the main colonnaded street where doors opened directly onto the public road. People could socialize easily, even in poor weather. According to him, this environment nurtured a respectful and active citizenry. The city council was honored by the people much like children respect their parents. Council membership often passed through generations of the same families, with members willingly spending their own wealth for public good. sometimes even driving themselves to financial ruin. They funded everything from bathhouses and theaters to horse races and grain supplies, not out of duty, but from a sense of civic pride. Libanius claimed they even refused to accept the legal exemptions they were entitled to, simply because they wanted to serve. Each council member, he said, took pride in outshining the one who came before and setting a standard no future member could match. They competed not just in generosity, but in creativity, adding new features to traditional public events to impress the public. This wasn't unique to Antioch. Cities in earlier centuries, like those in Bithynia, had acted the same way. The 2nd century writer Dio Chrysostom praised such civic generosity, but governors like Pliny the Younger were often overwhelmed by the financial recklessness of the councils trying to outdo each other, especially in tough economic times. Libanius also praised the intellectual strength of Antioch's council. Their skills in rhetoric and debate brought large crowds to their public discussions. These educated elites even earned the respect of imperial governors, who often invited them to participate in important decisions. In turn, the council freely expressed both praise and criticism, and their opinions carried real weight. In fact, Emperor Constantine had ordered that such public reactions be reported directly to him to evaluate a governor's performance. Libanius agreed. He believed that a governor's success depended heavily on how just the council believed his rulings to be. But this ideal version of Antioch wasn't the full picture. Libanius gave this speech during the city's Olympic Games, an event that, while still popular, was beginning to feel outdated. Athletic competitions were declining, and in a city with a large and increasingly confident Christian population, festivals honoring Zeus were becoming harder to justify. In reality, many counselors were no longer eager to serve or make sacrifices. Instead of refusing exemptions, they often looked for ways to avoid curial responsibilities altogether. While we don't have detailed records of the council, Libanius's own letters reveal he regularly helped friends escape these obligations. One man from Bithynia, Dionysius, even stayed in Antioch while waiting for a relative to become governor in his home province. Libanius wrote letters to influence officials, trying to get Dionysius a safe government job to shield him from curial duties. What's more, Libanius completely ignored the city's large and influential Christian population. Yet Christians had lived in Antioch since the 1st century, and by the 3rd century, their church was well established. Leaders like Paul of Samosata had even acted with the authority of secular rulers. Under emperors like Constantine and Constantius, Antioch hosted major church councils and became a center of Christian conflict. In the year 362, the Emperor Julian would face open resistance from Christians in Antioch after trying to interfere with their local saint's shrine. He later wrote a biting satire called The Beard Hater, mocking the city and its people for their defiance. And later in the 4th century, the famous preacher John Chrysostom would give passionate sermons that painted the Christian community as the true soul of Antioch. Still, Libanius presented Antioch as a lively and exciting place, a city of business, wealth, entertainment, and non-stop activity. Even without an emperor living there, it was home to major imperial officials: the Praetorian prefect, the Count of the East, and the governor of Syria. Each had their own responsibilities and large staffs. The Count's main job was to organize supplies for the Eastern military campaigns, but he also acted as a judge and kept order in the city. One key figure was Domitius Modestus, who later became the Praetorian prefect under Emperor Valens. His power was second only to the governors of Asia and Africa, and many counts like him later moved on to even higher positions. Meanwhile, The consular governors of Syria had less power and were usually in office for a short time, sometimes less than a year. They ran court cases, but could be overruled by higher officials. They also managed tax collection, though their methods were sometimes so aggressive that people said it felt more like being robbed than taxed. One story that highlights the tension between justice and personal influence in the late Roman Empire is that of Aristophanes of Corinth, a man caught in the crossfire of politics and patronage. He was a client of the famous orator Libanius, who tried to defend him by sending a written appeal to Emperor Julian in the year 362. In this petition, Libanius asked that Aristophanes be granted a pardon or some public recognition that would clear his name and allow him to return to Corinth with dignity. Aristophanes had been linked to a treason investigation, and although he wasn't found guilty of treason itself, the stain of having even been questioned as an accomplice was enough to ruin his reputation. Libanius believed that stepping in was the right thing to do. He saw this as correcting an injustice. But this case also shows a deeper problem in the Roman system: the clash between rule-based law and a culture of personal patronage. While the legal system tried to rely on formal procedures and fairness, the reality was that knowing the right people could make all the difference. Patronage worked through personal influence and discretion, not through rules. And this kind of interference didn't only come from pagans. Christian leaders also involved themselves in court cases, often urging mercy for the accused. Aristophanes' journey was typical of many men of the time, driven not by ambition, but by survival. Originally a city councilor in Corinth, he lost his land in a dispute with a corrupt official named Eugenius, who worked under Emperor Constantine. Forced to flee, Aristophanes ended up in Syria, where he stayed with a philosopher named Fortunatianus. Eventually, he found work under Constantius II as a government agent, a role known as agens in rebus. He carried out his duties with energy, though Libanius insisted he stayed honest and didn't engage in corruption. His life, like that of many in the late empire, was one of constant movement and adaptation. He had shifted from local government service to imperial employment, much like Libanius himself once did, except Aristophanes had little choice in the matter. And even serving the empire didn't guarantee protection. While working on the staff of Parnasius, the prefect of Egypt, Aristophanes was accused of embezzling a small amount of money and lost his position. Things got worse when Parnasius himself was suspected of treason. An infamous imperial investigator, known as Paul the Chain for his brutal methods, launched an inquiry that swept up Parnasius and his entire staff. Aristophanes admitted, perhaps foolishly, that he had introduced a fortune teller to Parnasius, but claimed it was only for personal matters, not political ones. Unfortunately for him, even private consultations with diviners were banned under a law passed by Constantine. That admission was all the evidence needed to link him to the broader treason case. Still, he was spared torture thanks to his status as a former city councilor. The final judge, Domitius Modestus, sent him into internal exile instead. To bring him back, Libanius appealed to Emperor Julian by focusing on the emperor's admiration for philosophers, as well as Aristophanes' suffering, supposed innocence, and overall misfortune. It helped that Julian deeply disliked Paul the Chain, whom he had already executed for his brutal methods. That personal grudge likely played a role in Julian's willingness to consider Libanius's request with sympathy, showing once again how personal feelings and connections could shape legal outcomes in an empire struggling to balance law and loyalty. When Emperor Julian came to Antioch in 362, his relationship with the city quickly turned sour. The tension reached its peak early in 363, when he wrote a sharp and ironic New Year address to the citizens called Beard Hater. or the Antiochian, depending on how you choose to interpret the title. In this satirical piece, Julian gave his own unflattering take on the city and its people, painting a very different picture from that of Libanius, the proud orator and lifelong Antiochene. While Libanius spoke of Antioch with affection and loyalty, Julian's tone was defensive and mocking. He had grown increasingly frustrated with a society that didn't share his values. His satire was a direct response to insults he had received during the city's wild New Year celebrations, similar to Rome's Saturnalia, where the normal order of things was turned upside down, and mocking authority was fair game. Julian was mocked for his long philosopher's beard, his rejection of public entertainment, and his stubborn devotion to the old pagan gods in a now mostly Christian city. In one part of the speech, Julian jokes about a riddle the citizens had come up with. The chai never harmed the city, nor did the kappa. It turns out these were not random letters, but clever ways of referring to Christ, chai, and the former emperor Constantius, kappa. Julian sarcastically responded that perhaps Constantius had indeed harmed the city, by not executing Julian himself. As for Christ, he pointed out that even though Christians in Emesa had destroyed pagan tombs, he had not retaliated against them. Yet the people of Antioch, he said, hated him simply because he was devoted to the traditional gods. Julian's dislike of public entertainments didn't help his popularity either. While Libanius loved the vibrant, always awake city, Julian proudly distanced himself from the fun. He admitted that he avoided theaters completely, and, even when he did attend, looked like someone being punished. He mocked his predecessors, including Constantius and his own relatives, for spending full days at the races, while he would only stay for 6 races, and even then without any excitement. Julian was following the example of serious-minded emperors like Marcus Aurelius, and ironically, he even aligned with Christian moralists who disapproved of gladiator shows and other public spectacles. But that kind of virtue did little to win over a city that loved pleasure and performance. Worse still, Julian's religious policies clashed head-on with Antioch's strong Christian identity. He took his pagan devotion to extremes. The people mocked how often he visited temples, sacrificing in the temple of Zeus, then Fortune, then Demeter, and back again to Zeus. On the Syrian New Year, he performed even more rituals. The public asked, who could tolerate an emperor who's always in the temples? His biggest offense came when he ordered the removal of the remains of Saint Babylas, a Christian martyr and former bishop of Antioch. The saint's body had been placed in a new church that stood on the site of the old shrine of Apollo at Daphne. Julian saw this as a desecration of sacred pagan ground and had the body removed. But Christians didn't stay quiet. In a solemn and defiant procession, they relocated the saint's remains to a new resting place. Not long after, the Temple of Apollo mysteriously burned down. Julian's response to these public challenges was sharp, but restrained. He leaned on a long-standing tradition of imperial tolerance that allowed citizens, especially in capital cities, to speak freely, even when criticizing the emperor. Earlier emperors like Diocletian, Constantine, and Constantius had also tolerated hostile crowds, sometimes laughing off mockery or ignoring vandalized statues. Julian, too, could have chosen harsher measures, exiles, executions, or stripping a city of its status and privileges. In other places, like Caesarea, Edessa, or Bostra, he had punished Christian factions harshly. But in Antioch, he simply announced he was leaving and would transfer his imperial presence to the nearby city of Tarsus. This was a subtle but serious punishment. Losing imperial favor meant losing economic prosperity and political influence. Although Beard Hater was styled as a satire, it functioned much like an imperial decree, a public message meant to scold and correct behavior. But ultimately, the piece also reveals Julian's struggles. Unlike the tolerant and patriotic Libanius, Julian came across as bitter and out of touch. He boasted about his stern lifestyle, his rejection of entertainment, and his old-fashioned values, traits that may have pleased his Gallic soldiers in the West, but felt alien to the lively, chaotic culture of the East. More than anything, Julian's downfall in Antioch came from his inability to understand the city's deep Christian identity. While Libanius accepted Christians as part of the city's fabric, despite later protesting against temple destruction, Julian only saw them as Galileans who, through their charitable works, encouraged the poor to admire godlessness. His failure to connect with the ordinary people of Antioch was not just a political mistake. It marked the deeper failure of his dream to restore the ancient gods of Rome in a world that had already moved on. Julian's reign as sole emperor lasted only 19 months, but the impact he made, both during his lifetime and after, was enormous. Few emperors have sparked such strong and divided opinions. His supporters included writers like the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, though even he had his doubts, his panegyrist Claudius Mamertinus, and his close ally, the orator Libanius. Later, the historian Eunapius would also speak highly of Julian, drawing on notes from Julian's friend and doctor, Oribasius. On the other hand, Christian thinkers like Gregory of Nazianzus, who had studied alongside Julian in Athens, and the Syrian poet Ephraim, who personally witnessed the aftermath of Julian's defeat in Persia, were deeply critical. While much attention is given to Julian's religious policies, they weren't the only controversial part of his reign. His bold military campaign against Persia in 363 baffled and disappointed many observers. Even Libanius, one of his strongest supporters, was left bewildered by the outcome. Ammianus, who admired Julian's energy and intelligence, still criticized his behavior in public, his dependence on philosophers, and his obsession with blood sacrifices. Clearly, doubts about Julian were not limited to his Christian opponents. What made Julian truly unique among Roman emperors was the way he presented himself in his writings. Other emperors had dabbled in literature. Hadrian tried poetry, Marcus Aurelius penned his Stoic meditations, and Constantine left behind speeches and reflections on Christianity. Even Constantius II gave poetry a try, though not very successfully. But Julian stood apart. He was by far the most prolific and wide-ranging writer of all the emperors. His surviving works include flattering speeches about Constantius II and Empress Eusebia, biting satire like the Caesars and Beard Hater, hymns to gods like Helios, philosophical essays often written as letters, and a vast collection of correspondence with friends, officials, and religious leaders. Though deeply personal in style, Julian always wrote as an emperor. His writings weren't just personal thoughts. They were political messages. His essays, letters, and philosophical musings were meant to shape public opinion and influence imperial policy. While he sometimes appeared to promote religious tolerance, his words made it clear that he did not believe all religions were equal. In his view, Christianity was a mistaken path, and he went to great lengths to justify his devotion to the old gods. Julian's legacy continues to spark debate. As the last pagan ruler of Rome, he became a symbol of resistance to Christianity, of a vanishing world. Raised as a Christian, Julian secretly embraced a mystical form of paganism around the year 351. His true beliefs weren't fully revealed until 361, after he became emperor. Once in power, he tried to undo Christianity's rise and rebuild the ancient pagan temple system that had once defined the Roman world. This sudden reversal posed a real threat to Christian communities, who had grown under imperial protection and now feared their progress could be lost. Beyond religion, Julian also had to face the empire's external threats and internal divisions. As Caesar in Gaul, he had managed to stabilize the western frontier and won great acclaim, especially after his victory at the Battle of Strasbourg. But that success had unexpected consequences. Julian grew suspicious of his cousin Constantius II, who had played a role in the massacre of Julian's family after Constantine's death. Tensions grew worse due to the scheming of courtiers and the loyalty Julian inspired in his Gallic troops. Eventually, in 361, Julian found himself unexpectedly elevated to supreme power, not through battle, but by the death of Constantius. He had expected to seize the empire by force, but ended up inheriting it. Now emperor of the East as well, Julian had to win over armies loyal to the late Constantius. Part of his motivation for launching a campaign against Persia was political. He needed a major victory to earn the support of these eastern troops. He may also have been trying to imitate Galerius, a past emperor who had won glory against Persia decades earlier. But Julian's Persian War ended in failure and cost him his life. Afterward, the empire took a much more cautious and frugal approach to managing its eastern border. In the end, while Julian's dramatic break with his predecessors is often emphasized, his similarities to them are just as important. He inherited the same problems: military pressures, fragile loyalties, and religious division, and responded with many of the same imperial instincts. What sets him apart is not just that he tried to revive a dying religion, but that he left behind such a vivid, personal record of his struggle to do so. Julian, later known as the Apostate, had a very different upbringing from the sons of Constantine. Born in Constantinople around the year 331, he lost his mother Basilina shortly after his birth. His father was Julius Constantius, half-brother of Emperor Constantine, making Julian a direct descendant of Constantius I through his second wife, Theodora. Unlike Constantine, whose lineage came through Helena, Julian identified himself with Theodora's side of the family. Still, when trying to justify his later rebellion, he reminded the people of Athens that he and Constantius II were first cousins, sons of two brothers, and that blood loyalty had been betrayed. Julian never forgot the massacre of 337 when he was just 6 years old. In that brutal purge following Constantine's death, his father, his uncle Dalmatius, and several cousins were all executed. The young Julian and his half-brother Gallus were spared, perhaps because their sister was married to Constantius II. But Julian squarely blamed Constantius for the murders and never forgave him. Julian's education reflected his outsider status. He was not raised in the palace or groomed for power. His first teacher, Mardonius, taught him the classics, especially Homer and Hesiod. More than just literature, these works were presented as guides to moral and religious truth. This early exposure to ancient ideals would later shape Julian's worldview as emperor. At age 11, Julian and Gallus were placed under house arrest at a country estate in Cappadocia. Though isolated and closely watched, Julian read obsessively. He found books in the household libraries and even read from the collection of the Bishop George of Cappadocia, which he would later claim as his own property after the bishop's death. At 17, Julian was finally allowed to leave the estate. He returned to Constantinople and began traveling. In Nicomedia, he likely read Plato and encountered the influential philosopher Themistius. His education expanded to include the writings of Aristotle and the powerful ideas of Neoplatonism. In time, he met key figures like Odysseus, a disciple of the mystical Platonist Iamblichus, and the controversial theurgist Maximus of Ephesus. It was under Maximus's guidance that Julian secretly abandoned Christianity in 351, even though he continued to pretend to follow the faith for another decade. For critics of Julian, this deep immersion in mystical philosophy and ritual sacrifice was proof that his education had led him astray. The teachings of Iamblichus, rooted in the ideas of Plato, Porphyry, and Plotinus, were difficult for most people to grasp. These philosophers focused on ascending levels of reality and the soul's journey toward unity with the divine. They didn't concern themselves much with civic duty or the public good, something Julian's opponents would later use against him. Even as emperor, Julian was more a philosopher than a ruler. He spent much of his time writing letters and essays that explored his spiritual beliefs. In his hymn to Helios, he explained how the sun was more than a celestial body. It was the bridge between the material world and the divine. In this belief system, Helios Mithra stood at the center of all existence, merging the qualities of many other gods: Apollo, Dionysus, Asclepius, and even Zeus. This vision was far more sophisticated than the cult of Sol Invictus, followed by earlier emperors like Aurelian, and sometimes even Constantine. Yet Julian's religious ideas, though intellectually rich, were hardly accessible to the average Roman. Julian believed that ritual connected human beings to the divine. Inspired by Iamblichus, he held that correct ritual behavior could attract divine favor, and even allow the worshipper to share in the nature of the gods. This practice, known as theurgy, or God-working, was meant to be a spiritual science, but to many, it looked like magic. Julian's teacher Maximus was said to make statues move and perform supernatural feats, which further deepened suspicions. While some Platonists preferred the rational side of philosophy, blending it with Aristotelian logic, Julian and his circle followed a more mystical path, one that many considered dangerously irrational. In the end, Julian's personal religion was not simply old-fashioned paganism. It was a complex, mystical system that few understood and even fewer accepted. While Julian believed he was restoring the true faith of Rome, his beliefs alienated Christians and confused pagans alike. His version of spirituality, esoteric, symbolic, and elite, never gained the broad support he hoped for. It made him unique in Roman history, but also isolated. And that isolation would shape the course of his short and fateful reign. Julian's time as Caesar in Gaul laid the groundwork for his eventual rise to supreme power. Through a mix of military victories, especially his triumph at Strasbourg, and popular policies like tax reductions, he secured both loyalty and admiration. During these years, Julian also clashed with several senior officials appointed by his cousin, Emperor Constantius II. He especially butted heads with Barbatio and the Praetorian prefect Florentius. In their place, Julian appointed men he trusted, like Claudius Mamertinus, who handled imperial finances, and Flavius Navita, his cavalry commander, both of whom would later serve as consuls in 362. Despite his reputation for being suspicious, Constantius sometimes backed Julian when he believed he was right. Still, much of our negative image of Constantius comes from Julian's own writings, supported by the historian Ammianus, which paint Constantius as easily manipulated by scheming courtiers. The turning point came in 360, when Julian was proclaimed Emperor Augustus for a second time, this time in Paris. At this stage, there was no turning back. His path to power was paved by the close connection between battlefield success and political legitimacy. After his victory at Strasbourg, Julian spent the next 2 years raiding Germanic territories and forcing the Franks and Alemanni into submission. His disputes with Constantius's officials continued, especially over taxes. Julian rejected Florentius's plan to impose extra levies, refusing to burden the people further. But the situation escalated when Constantius demanded that Julian send 4 elite military units to Persia to help with a campaign against renewed attacks from the east. Julian reluctantly began to comply, sending off the Celtae and Petulantes units. But the other 2 units, the Auruli and Batavians, were still in Britain under the command of Lupicinus, Julian's general, who had been sent to suppress a rebellion by the Picts and Scots. Julian knew trouble was coming. He had already promised his soldiers, many of them Germanic recruits, that they wouldn't be sent out of Gaul. Soon, a mysterious pamphlet appeared in the camp, warning that the soldiers were about to be shipped off like criminals, abandoning their families to the mercy of the enemy. When they reached Paris, Julian met them in person and delivered a calming speech. That evening, he hosted their commanders for dinner and invited them to speak freely about their concerns. But the situation exploded. That night, the soldiers rioted. They surrounded Julian's palace and declared him Augustus. The next morning, Julian emerged and publicly claimed he had no desire for the title. But the pressure was overwhelming. He was hoisted onto a shield and crowned with the chain of a standard-bearer from the Petulantes. To seal the deal, he promised the troops a generous donative, 5 gold coins and a pound of silver each, along with pledges of good governance and reform. Any opposition was quickly dealt with. Lupicinus was arrested, and Florentius fled across the Alps. Julian insisted that he had been forced into accepting the title without prior approval from Constantius. But many wondered how accidental it really was. Like the usurper Magnentius a decade earlier, Julian denied any personal ambition. Still, the dinner with the officers, conveniently left out of his official account, strongly resembled Magnentius's own rise. Adding a mystical touch, Julian later claimed that the night before his acclamation, he was visited in a dream by a spirit known as the Genius of the Republic, who warned that if he refused the will of the people, divine favor would be withdrawn. It was a powerful message that echoed the traditions of Constantine and the earlier tetrarchs, who had also claimed divine backing for their rule. At this point, however, only a few knew which gods Julian truly followed. Constantius did not immediately react. Julian used the time to strengthen his hold in the West. He launched another successful campaign against the Franks, made new appointments, and celebrated the 5th year of his reign with games in Vienne, publicly wearing the robes of an Augustus. In the spring of 361, he even accused Constantius of treachery, arresting the Alemannic king Vadimarius for allegedly conspiring with Constantius to stir up trouble in Gaul and delay Julian's departure. With his position secure in Gaul, Julian decided it was time to move. He launched a 3-pronged campaign against Constantius. One army moved through Raetia and Noricum, another through northern Italy, while Julian himself advanced along the Danube. He reached Sirmium with little resistance and secured the pass into Thrace. But his momentum was fragile. The different Roman armies, those from Gaul and the Danube region, often pursued their own agendas. 2 legions loyal to Constantius, which Julian had hoped to neutralize by stationing in Gaul, instead marched to Italy, and laid siege to Aquileia, which declared for Constantius. Meanwhile, the Roman Senate rebuffed Julian's envoys, stating coldly, "We demand respect for your creator." Things looked bleak. Constantius, though known for losing foreign wars, had a reputation for winning civil ones. He was now finally marching west. But just when Julian's hopes seemed in danger, fate intervened. In November 361, Constantius died of illness in Cilicia at the age of 44. According to some, he named Julian as his heir on his deathbed. Others claimed Julian was simply hailed by the army. Either way, Julian took it as a sign from the gods that his rise was meant to be. On December 11th, 361, Julian entered Constantinople in triumph. The city was still mourning Constantius, and Julian made a show of honoring his predecessor with a grand state funeral. With that, Julian became the undisputed ruler, the sole Augustus of the entire Roman Empire. When Julian became emperor, he faced a major challenge. Though hailed as a hero in the West, he was virtually unknown to the Eastern legions and their commanders. The Eastern bureaucracy was still full of officials loyal to his late cousin Constantius II, many of whom Julian held personally responsible for past betrayals, especially the downfall of his brother Gallus. With military support behind him, and perhaps driven by his own sense of justice or revenge, Julian initiated a wave of political trials shortly after taking power. These trials were held in Chalcedon, across the Bosphorus from Constantinople, and were overseen by a panel that included both Julian's supporters and remnants of the previous regime. Some of the empire's top officials faced judgment. Among them were Evagrius, who oversaw imperial estates, Ursulus, who handled imperial finances, and Florentius, who had served as head of the emperor's personal staff. Several were exiled or executed, particularly those connected to the conspiracy that had destroyed Gallus. While the historian Ammianus deeply regretted the death of Ursulus, whom he viewed as a decent man, he welcomed the fall of others, especially the feared interrogator, Paul the Chain, and the corrupt eunuch Eusebius, both of whom had long been symbols of imperial excess, and tensions within Julian's circle were still high, and concerns about the security of his rule surfaced publicly in early 362. That year, a speech of thanks was delivered in Constantinople by Claudius Mamertinus, Julian's close ally and new consul. As Julian's former finance minister and now a senior administrator, Mamertinus used the occasion to both celebrate his emperor and defend his own position. His speech praised Julian in conventional terms, highlighting his victories in Gaul and his protection of Roman citizens, not just from barbarian invasions, but also from greedy provincial governors. Without naming him directly, Mamertinus painted Constantius as a weak ruler who failed to stop corruption and allowed incompetence to thrive. Julian's march eastward was framed as yet another campaign to protect the empire, this time from the Danube frontier, where frightened enemies watched from across the river as Julian restored cities, brought food supplies to Rome, and lived simply while showing generosity to all. Mamertinus then shifted to the legitimacy of his own elevation to consul. Unlike in the Old Republic, he didn't need to beg or bribe anyone. His promotion came as a gift from a rightful emperor. This emphasis on Julian's lawful rule was clearly aimed at critics in Constantinople, who still questioned whether his rise was legitimate. Officially, Julian was the closest living relative of Constantius, and many believed the late emperor had named him as successor. He had even organized a grand state funeral to honor Constantius. Still, Mamertinus didn't emphasize continuity. Instead, he subtly attacked Constantius's rule by accusing him of failing to protect the state. Constantius, he claimed, had allowed conspiracies against Julian, permitted governors to abuse their power, and presided over a corrupt court where positions were bought with bribes to women, eunuchs, and self-serving officials. The most serious charge, now aired publicly for the first time, was that Constantius had conspired with Vadimarius, the king of the Alemanni, to launch an attack on Julian in Gaul. In doing so, the late emperor had risked the empire's security to protect his own position. By exposing this plot, Mamertinus aimed to fully discredit Constantius, and by extension, the legacy of the Constantine dynasty itself. In this speech, the message was clear. Julian was not just the new emperor, he was the moral opposite of his predecessor. Where Constantius was weak, Julian was strong. Where Constantius had ruled through fear and favoritism, Julian promised justice, reform, and restoration. But behind the praise and performance lay a deeper reality. Julian's power still rested on fragile ground, and the fight for legitimacy had only just begun. Julian's early days as emperor were marked by bold decisions and sharp contrasts with his predecessors, especially Constantius II. Instead of seeking reconciliation with former supporters of the previous regime, Julian's administration took a confrontational tone. This wasn't simply a political misstep. On the contrary, it reflected a conscious break with the past. Julian made it clear, through policy and through speeches like the one delivered by his loyal consul Claudius Mamertinus, that the old way of ruling was over. In praising the return of pagan philosophy, clothed in purple, Mamertinus and Julian signaled the end of Christian dominance introduced by Constantine and his dynasty. This break with tradition extended beyond ideology. Julian deliberately adopted a new style of rulership, one that was austere, informal, and at times even eccentric. He dismissed the overpaid palace officials who had thrived under Constantius and scaled back the elaborate court ceremonies that had become routine. At his own consular inauguration, he famously gave the starting signal for the games, an act technically improper, and then fined himself 10 pounds of gold for the breach of protocol. While in Constantinople, he often appeared before the Senate and showed them deference, a gesture meant to display humility. But not everyone admired this informality. The historian Ammianus criticized him for rushing out of a Senate meeting just to embrace his old teacher Maximus, arguing that such behavior lacked the dignity expected of an emperor. Julian's satire Missapogon, written for the people of Antioch in early 363, also revealed how he struggled with public expectations. Although the work fits into the tradition of light-hearted New Year mockery, its sharp and ironic tone reflected a deeper misunderstanding of how emperors were supposed to present themselves in public life. But Julian's reforms weren't limited to style. He launched a wide-ranging effort to cut waste and root out abuse, especially in the imperial postal service known as the cursus publicus. Concerned about the overuse of travel permits and mounting costs, Julian limited the number of post warrants that officials could issue. In emergencies, a small reserve, written by Julian himself, would be hand-delivered by trusted deputies. In places where the postal service had little use, like Sardinia, he abolished it entirely. But even there, he made exceptions for transporting the annona, the grain tax vital to feeding Rome. Some of the laws he approved were remarkably specific. One legal ruling, preserved in both the Theodosian and Justinian codes, carefully defined what counted as a supernumerary horse. If a warrant said 1 horse, then a second was extra. If it said 2, then only the third was considered supernumerary. It may seem overly obvious, but its inclusion in later legal codes shows that even the smallest details mattered, and that Julian, or someone close to him, was deeply involved in administrative reform. Julian also made a determined, though largely unsuccessful, effort to revive urban life in the eastern provinces. One of his goals was to restore local councils and fill the seats that had been abandoned. His ally Libanius praised him for removing unjust exemptions, arguing that all eligible citizens should fulfill their civic duties. But not everyone agreed. Ammianus, speaking perhaps for many in Antioch, criticized Julian for canceling long-standing privileges, especially those given to veterans, and for issuing inconsistent rulings in appeals. The truth was, Julian was fighting a losing battle. Cities in the east were steadily losing their best minds to the imperial bureaucracy in Constantinople, which offered far more attractive careers. No law could reverse that trend. Still, Julian tried to help. He combined tax relief with generous policies aimed at helping cities recover. In Gaul, he had already shown a willingness to ease burdens, and as he moved eastward in 361, he extended those same policies to Illyricum, Greece, and Thrace. His letters show that he responded positively to appeals for tax relief from various cities. One early reform involved the aurum coronarium, a gold payment supposedly given voluntarily by cities to honor the emperor. Julian reaffirmed its voluntary nature, though the policy was quickly reversed by later rulers. He also clarified that city councilors, known as decurions, did not have to pay trade taxes unless they were actually traders. Large families were rewarded as well. Those with 13 children, for instance, could be exempted from council service. To boost civic engagement, Julian introduced new urban officials. One such post was the zygostates, who was responsible for evaluating the quality and weight of worn or chipped gold coins. This was a practical innovation that survived long after Julian's reign. In the end, Julian's reforms were a mix of idealism and pragmatism. He saw himself not just as a ruler, but as a restorer of Roman virtue and city life. He challenged the legacy of Constantine, not with open declarations of hostility, but through a steady stream of laws, speeches, and symbolic gestures. Whether those reforms were sustainable or even realistic was another matter. But for Julian, it was all part of a mission to build a new empire rooted in the old ideals of Rome, led by philosophy, shaped by reason, and free from the corruption and excess he believed had poisoned the imperial court. Much of Julian's legislation, preserved in legal collections, dealt with routine matters, the kind of ongoing work every emperor was expected to manage. With the help of his advisors, Julian upheld many legal norms established by earlier rulers. He confirmed the rights of women to retain dowries, ruled that land gifts to underage brides were valid if properly recorded, ensured that legal appeals had to pass through proper channels, and introduced fines if they weren't filed within 30 days. But even in civil law, where religion wasn't directly involved, Julian didn't shy away from challenging Constantine's legacy. He reversed Constantine's rulings on who could be sued as a co-defendant, and brought back an older law that required a magistrate's approval for property sales by underage wives, something Constantine had relaxed with only the husband's permission. Julian's religious policies, however, were far more aggressive. He openly attacked Christianity, calling its followers Galileans. He removed their special privileges, like exemption from city council service, and allowed exiled clergy to return, but blocked them from regaining their church offices. Public rituals honoring martyrs were scaled back, especially funeral processions, which he banned during the day, claiming that contact with the dead caused pollution. One incident in Antioch made headlines across the empire. Years earlier, Julian's brother Gallus had placed the relics of the Christian martyr Babylas inside Apollo's sanctuary at Daphne. Julian ordered their removal. Christians responded with a large, joyful procession as they moved the relics. Soon after, the Temple of Apollo burned down. Julian, without evidence, blamed the Christians and retaliated by seizing the funds of Antioch's main church. Even some non-Christians were uncomfortable with Julian's measures. The historian Ammianus criticized a decree banning Christians from teaching the pagan classics. Julian believed that those who rejected the old gods had no right to explain texts built on traditional morality. To him, ancient literature wasn't just art. It was a guide to living a virtuous life rooted in pagan belief. In his eyes, Christians couldn't teach Homer or Plato with integrity while preaching Christian values. Instead, he argued, they should stick to the Gospels of Mark and Luke. For Christian scholars like Gregory of Nazianzus, this was a painful blow. For years, they had balanced their faith with their love of classical literature. Julian's policy forced them to choose. Some resigned from their posts, while others, like the teacher Ausonius, seemed to carry on unaffected. Still, Julian had raised a question that would haunt Christians for generations. Could Christianity and classical culture truly coexist? Julian's strategy against Christianity wasn't just about restriction, it was also about replacement. Like earlier pagan emperors, he tried to build a rival religious system. He planned a new provincial priesthood that would mirror the Christian church in social outreach. These pagan priests would receive grain and wine at public expense, part for their servants, and the rest to be given to the poor. Unlike Christians, who relied on donations from the faithful, Julian's priests were state-funded. He also demanded high standards from these priests. They were to worship with their entire households, avoid taverns and theaters, and stay away from immoral behavior. Philosophers like Epicurus were banned, as were poets like Archilochus, who wrote indecent verse. Priests who fell short were to be disciplined or even dismissed by their superiors. Dissent within a priest's household wouldn't be tolerated either. While Julian claimed to uphold religious freedom, the reality was different. Christians weren't openly persecuted, but they were slowly pushed out of influence. Julian still acted as an impartial judge in court, but he sometimes asked about the religion of the people appearing before him, a move that was deeply unsettling, even if it didn't always lead to consequences. Behind the scenes, though, the discrimination was real. Julian instructed palace officials to favor God-fearing candidates, code for pagans, over Christians. He didn't force anyone to convert, but he used every tool at his disposal to weaken Christian communities. In one case, Julian promised state support to the Temple of the Great Mother in Pessinus, if the entire city embraced the cult. In another, when two Christian factions fought in Edessa, he seized their property and gave some of the money to the army, sarcastically claiming that poverty might help the Christians get to heaven faster. Julian also cracked down on Christian unrest in cities like Bostra, branding believers as sacrilegious fanatics who worshipped bones and relics instead of gods. The message was loud and clear. Under Julian, Christians would no longer enjoy the privileges they had come to expect. While he spoke of tolerance, his actions told a different story. For those loyal to the Christian God, Julian's rule was not a return to balance, but a cold war cloaked in rituals and laws. In the spring of 363, Emperor Julian set out from Antioch, determined to strike a decisive blow against the Persian Empire. With an enormous army of 65,000 troops, he marched to Carrhae, the legendary site of Rome's humiliating defeat centuries earlier, to launch his bold eastern campaign. On the surface, Julian presented this expedition as a correction to the cautious policies of his predecessor, Constantius II, whose defensive approach had cost Rome several border cities. Julian aimed not just to reclaim lost ground, but to secure a lasting peace through total victory. But Julian's ambitions ran deeper than mere strategy. Inspired by the legacies of conquerors like Alexander the Great, Trajan, Lucius Verus, and Septimius Severus, he envisioned himself as the next great Roman hero. Accompanying him was Hormisdas, a Persian prince and would-be rival to King Shapur, signaling Julian's hopes of not only invading Persia, but perhaps even toppling its king. His target, the mighty city of Ctesiphon on the Tigris, once taken by Severus in 198. This campaign also carried a personal weight. Though Julian had proven his military strength in Gaul, he still had to win over the Eastern Roman army, many of whom remained loyal to the legacy of Constantius. A grand victory would not only secure Julian's political standing, it would also affirm his favor with the gods. And that divine approval, he believed, would give him greater authority in his struggle against the growing power of Christianity. Not everyone shared Julian's confidence. Some critics warned that the campaign was driven more by pride than practicality. Historian Ammianus scolded those he called lazy and malicious for doubting Julian, but even he admitted the omens were troubling. Julian's own Etruscan diviners advised against the invasion, but their voices were drowned out by philosophers in the emperor's circle who insisted on pressing forward even if they didn't fully understand the risks. At Carrhae, Julian split his forces. A detachment of 30,000 men, led by his relative Procopius and the general Sebastianus, was sent east to join the Armenian king Arsaces and mislead the Persians about the true direction of the invasion. It worked for a while. Meanwhile, Julian moved south along the Euphrates with the main army, coordinating with a fleet of supply ships. The slow-moving column, stretched across 10 miles, began losing the element of surprise. The Romans encountered fierce resistance. Persian and Arab horsemen used guerrilla tactics to harass the marching army, while local defenders flooded the fields to bog down their advance. Still, the army pushed forward, navigating through an old canal built by Trajan and Severus, eventually reaching the walls of Ctesiphon. The city, however, proved too strong. Despite an early Roman success in repelling a Persian force, the walls of Ctesiphon held firm. There was no backup plan. Julian's generals debated pushing deeper into Persian territory, but the Tigris River current made it impossible to advance the fleet. In a shocking decision, the emperor ordered the destruction of the ships, saving only a few for bridge building. Morale plummeted. Rumors spread that Persian spies were sabotaging Roman plans from within. On June 16th, Julian gave up on Ctesiphon and turned the army northward, retreating alongside the Tigris in hopes of reaching safety in Roman territory. Persian and Saracen cavalry stalked them relentlessly. Then, one day, a massive dust cloud appeared on the horizon. By dawn, it was clear. The Persian king's army had arrived. Julian refused to negotiate. 10 days into the retreat, during a skirmish, he rushed into battle without proper armor and was struck by a cavalry spear. That night, he died from his wounds. Almost immediately, rumors about his death began to swirl. Was he killed by a Saracen warrior, a Christian enemy, or a soldier from his own ranks? No one could say for certain, but those closest to him worked quickly to shape the memory of his final moments. They portrayed him as a philosopher to the very end, calmly discussing the soul's immortality with his friends Maximus and Priscus, just as Socrates had done before his own death centuries earlier. Julian's dramatic death on the Persian front left the Roman army stranded deep in enemy territory, without a leader and far from safety. In the chaos that followed, the troops quickly chose a new emperor, Jovian, a tall, unassuming man in his early 30s, with no ties to Julian or the Constantinian dynasty. His first task was not glory, but survival. He needed to negotiate a way out. The peace treaty that followed was bitterly criticized, especially by the historian Ammianus. While the Roman army was allowed to withdraw unharmed, it came at a steep price. The strategically vital cities of Singara and Nisibis were handed back to the Persians. Their citizens were allowed to flee into Roman territory, but their homes were lost. For Christian voices like Ephraim of Nisibis, it was divine justice. Julian's lifeless body outside the city, and the Persian banner flying above it symbolized what happened to those who defied God. For Ammianus, though, the blame lay with Jovian. Whatever Julian's faults, he had terrified the Persians, taken key fortresses, and even damaged the enemy's elite war elephants. But in the end, the treaty made it clear. Rome had not won. After Julian, border disputes continued from time to time, especially over Armenia, but large-scale war in the east paused for decades. Not until the 6th century would the empire see another conflict of similar scale. Julian, for all his flaws, had what Constantius lacked: charisma. He was eloquent, passionate, and deeply polarizing. He inspired admiration and resentment in equal measure. While not an original philosopher, he brought personal energy into the struggle between paganism and Christianity, attempting to revive the ancient ideals of a philosopher king. But even during his lifetime, it was clear that his efforts to curb Christianity were faltering. He had recognized, rightly, that Christianity's strength came from its organized community and social outreach. His solution was to create a pagan alternative. But what he offered was complex, elitist, and disconnected from the ordinary people. Intellectual pagans might embrace his vision, but rituals like animal sacrifice had long since lost their appeal with the wider public. And even if Julian had dared to outlaw Christianity completely, a step no Roman emperor had yet taken, he had no strong replacement to offer. Julian's wider record as emperor was mixed. He tried to rein in administrative spending, as others had done before him, but with little lasting success. Like many emperors, he attempted to revive the traditional city councils, but failed to recognize that power was shifting elsewhere. Bishops were emerging as local leaders, and imperial administrators, drawn to Constantinople, were filling the vacuum. His vision for local leadership was outdated before it began. Still, what set Julian apart was not just his reforms, but his style of rule. He was spontaneous, informal, and often insensitive to the expectations of his subjects. He didn't fully grasp the public dignity that came with being emperor. His rise to power, once celebrated by his ally Mamertinus, had been divisive. His repeated attacks on Constantine's laws alienated many, and by questioning his predecessor's legitimacy, he unwittingly undermined the very authority of the imperial office. His failure in Persia was not entirely his own doing. Winning the loyalty of the Eastern army was politically necessary. But Julian's decision to march deep into enemy territory echoed a familiar Roman pattern: the need to prove an emperor's right to rule through military conquest. In this, he followed the path of Alexander the Great, hoping to win eternal glory. Ironically, it was Constantius, often dismissed as dull and cautious, who had resisted that temptation and shown a deeper understanding of what emperorship required. That Constantius may have been the wiser ruler is something Julian's admirer Ammianus could never bring himself to admit. Julian's death in Persia marked the end of more than just his reign. It closed the final chapter of a dynasty. His successor, Jovian, mockingly nicknamed the funeral director, for presiding over the burials of both Constantius II and Julian, ruled for just 8 months. In February 364, Jovian died suddenly, and the Eastern army, needing a new leader, elevated a capable officer named Valentinian I. Soon after, Valentinian appointed his brother Valens as co-emperor, founding a new dynasty that would rule the Eastern Empire until 450 and the West until 455. Not everyone welcomed this change. In 365, a man named Procopius, distantly related to the old Constantinian line, tried to reclaim power. His rebellion failed quickly, and what was left of Constantine's family quietly faded into obscurity, though Constantius II's posthumous daughter did later marry Gratian, the son of Valentinian. The deaths of Julian and Jovian didn't just bring an end to one dynasty, they marked the close of what historians often call the long 3rd century. For over 100 years, Rome had struggled to maintain unity, fending off barbarian invasions and avoiding internal collapse. From Diocletian to Constantine and their successors, emperors worked tirelessly to keep the frontiers secure, projecting themselves as undefeated military leaders blessed by divine favor. This image of power was essential. Whether the emperor claimed victory in the name of Jupiter or the Christian god, success on the battlefield was seen as proof of legitimacy. Repeated campaigns against Germanic tribes or Eastern powers like Persia weren't always necessary for defense, but they reinforced the image of Rome as unshakable and of the emperor as divinely chosen. Still, the cost of keeping the empire on a permanent war footing, lives, money, resources, remains difficult to calculate. In truth, even Rome's military couldn't control the shifting forces beyond its borders. By the late 4th century, the situation grew worse. Barbarian tribes that were once kept at bay were now entering Roman territory as federate allies, unassimilated and unstable. Beyond the frontiers, a new force was rising: the Huns. Their arrival disrupted the fragile balance, and in the early 5th century, the western frontier along the Rhine collapsed. One by one, provinces like Gaul, Spain, and North Africa were carved up by Germanic peoples. Julian's death was a turning point. It marked the unraveling of the old unified empire and accelerated the growing divide between East and West. In the 5th century, that division would become permanent. The Eastern Empire, Greek-speaking and centered in Constantinople, would survive and even thrive, while the West fractured into a patchwork of kingdoms. Though Latin would remain the language of government in the East well into the 6th century, Constantinople increasingly took on its own distinct identity. Still, we shouldn't project that divide too early. In Julian's time, many people continued to move freely across the empire, from Bordeaux to Jerusalem, as traders, pilgrims, and officials, living under one imperial system. Administratively, the foundations of this later Roman world had been laid by Diocletian and Constantine. Diocletian reorganized provinces, reformed the tax system, and created a more centralized government. Constantine continued that work, refining the imperial court and its bureaucracy. The result was a government that was structured, rule-bound, and intensely competitive. Even the often overlooked sons of Constantine contributed to this transformation. Constantius II, in particular, played a key role in elevating Constantinople. He strengthened its Senate and may have introduced the office of the imperial quaestor, a top legal official. That very office would later shape one of Rome's most enduring legacies, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the great legal code of Justinian in the 6th century. By then, men like Tribonian and John Lydus were working in an administrative environment that their 4th century predecessors would have instantly recognized. In this context of gradual reform and centralization, Constantine's relationship with Christianity becomes even more significant. Like other emperors, he responded to pressures from both his officials and his people. Roman law, to be effective, had to target actions, not beliefs. Early laws against Christians didn't ban the religion outright, but restricted practices like their secret meetings or confiscated their sacred books. Later, when Constantine turned away from sacrifice, he didn't need to ban paganism directly. Animal sacrifice was already falling out of fashion, often associated with magic and superstition. Constantine's genius was in aligning his policies with the evolving culture. He promoted Christianity in a way that pleased his new Christian allies, but remained acceptable to many pagans as well. Julian had tried to undo that shift and bring back the old gods, but the world had moved on. His paganism was too intellectual, too elitist, and too out of step with the people. His failure wasn't just military. It was spiritual, cultural, and deeply political. And so, with Julian's fall and Jovian's brief rule, a new chapter opened. The empire was no longer one unified world ruled by divine warriors. It was now 2 evolving realms, heading in different directions, but still bearing the marks of the great reforms of the 4th century. The legacy of Diocletian and Constantine would echo through centuries, not just in law and bureaucracy, but in the very survival of Rome's eastern half long after the West had crumbled. The contrast between Constantine and Julian tells us much about the challenges of leadership in a changing empire. Both emperors believed that people should not be persecuted for their religious beliefs. Both spoke openly and often about their personal philosophies, and both used imperial funds to support the gods they favored. But the differences between them are far more telling. Constantine, ruling a Christian community already deeply rooted in Roman cities, worked with an organized and self-assured church. Even with internal conflicts, Christians had a clear identity and growing influence. Julian, in contrast, tried to recreate a form of paganism that had never truly existed. He had to build a new priesthood from scratch, teach it how to function, and fund its revival. His religion felt out of touch, too intellectual, too elitist, and lacked broad appeal. Another key difference was in temperament. Constantine knew when to separate his personal beliefs from state affairs. Julian, however, often let his personal resentment toward Christians show in official matters, weakening his leadership. More importantly, Constantine understood the spiritual mood of his time. He embraced the growing trend toward monotheism, while traditional Roman rituals like animal sacrifice were already seen as outdated or even suspicious. Julian, instead of adapting to the new religious culture, tried to force a revival of ancient customs that many no longer respected. Throughout this transformative period, Christianity remained a distinct institution. Constantine and his sons did not interfere with church governance. Church laws and penalties operated alongside those of the state. The only major involvement came when emperors enforced church decisions on theological disputes, often punishing those who ended up on the losing side. But as disagreements deepened, especially in the 340 Faisiu, when different emperors supported rival factions, the church began to assert its own independence. One symbol of this shift was Bishop Ambrose of Milan, who, by the 370s, boldly defended the church's autonomy, even denying sinful emperors entry into his church. Meanwhile, asceticism, choosing a life of strict religious devotion, became a source of division. Some elite Romans embraced it, causing controversy in society and even within the Senate. Tensions also rose between local bishops and charismatic holy men who lived outside official church structures and often criticized the corruption they saw in church leadership. Sometimes asceticism itself came under suspicion, linked to heresy or social rebellion. This was not a peaceful or forgiving age. Those shut out from power rarely got second chances. But imperial women, though voiceless in public affairs, still played influential roles. Constantine's mother, Helena, had already set a powerful example by supporting Christianity. By the year 400, especially in the Eastern Court, now based in Constantinople, women's influence was more openly recognized. But in the Western Empire, this growing visibility brought danger. With the rise of child emperors, like Valentinian II and Valentinian III, real control often passed to their mothers or to powerful generals. Unlike Constantine's sons, whose rule was safeguarded by their father's long life and authority, these child emperors were vulnerable. Their mothers could not lead armies, so military power shifted back into the hands of generals. These men, figures like Stilicho, Aetius, and Ricimer, controlled politics from behind the scenes. They made and unmade emperors, ruling from the shadows with swords instead of crowns. The new empire crafted by Diocletian, Constantine, and their successors was full of contradictions. Its administrative structure was revolutionary, streamlined and centralized, but it was built on top of provinces and cities that had existed for centuries, each proud of its identity and autonomy. Christianity, the so-called new religion, carried within it the ancient traditions of Jewish law and Greco-Roman thought. And though new dynasties claimed to bring stability, the same dangers always lurked. Local armies with shifting loyalties, ambitious generals with imperial dreams, and a constant need for rulers to prove they deserved the throne. In the end, Roman emperors still ruled not by brute force alone, but through the willing acceptance of their subjects. That acceptance had to be earned through communication, through law, and through the careful balancing of tradition and innovation. From Constantine to Julian, from bishops to generals, from Helena to Ricimer, the story of Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries is one of transformation and of an empire that refused to collapse quietly.